This is a slide that tells you who I am, where I try and convince you that I actually know what I'm talking about. But I have been a game store owner. I have self-published board games successfully through Kickstarter. I have gotten games licensed through major publishers, AEG and WizKids. And then I did 120 games at a rate of 1 game a month for 10 years through my website, Invisible City Productions. So I've done over 140 games from concept to final creation. So I've got half a clue. As I was saying, I'm going to be talking about 4 broad categories of information: design, workflow, prototyping, and publishing. I'm going to be giving you the best tips I can. I'm going to be going very, very quickly, and I apologize for that in advance. If you have any questions, unlike everybody else who's been a very gracious presenter and let you talk during the presentation, write your questions down, save them for the Q&A. I'm going to try and have at least 15 minutes of Q&A and general discussion, because I know that the information I have, this is all my opinion. Much of it's through hard-won experience, but some of it's just where I'm at and what I'm doing. With that, that's the other thing, is that there's going to be QR codes for the slide deck and for contact information for me at the very end. This is a Google Slides deck, so anyone's going to have access to it. So don't worry if you miss something. It'll be available at the very end. Did you have a quick question?
That was a thumbs up.
Oh, fantastic, because no questions during the presentation. All right, let's get started. 12 essential things. First one, and this is the most important thing. If you leave here and only remember one thing from this presentation, it's incentivize the behavior you want. I've also run Protospiels. I ran Protospiel South in Austin for 5 years. I started it there. Anyway, the point though is that time and time again, you hear a person saying, the players won't do what I want them to do. They're turtling when I want them to be attacking. Then you gotta look at what you're doing, and you want to incentivize the behaviors you want. If they're turtling, it's because turtling is too beneficial. If they're not attacking, it's because there's not enough reward. The corollary to this is to use carrots and not sticks. If you have an upkeep sequence at the end of the turn, you gotta go ahead and draw a card from the monster deck so you know what the monster's doing, right? But if it's not like a really important thing, they're going to forget it, because nobody wants to hit themselves with a stick. If you say, if you draw a card from the monster deck, you get a cookie, a reroll token, an extra die for the next turn, whatever, and the monster does something, darn tootin' they're gonna remember it, because carrots work better than sticks. Number 2, connect at trade shows. I am the jerk who put in the thing in the previous presentation, go to trade shows, right? It got 5 thumbs up, I'm so proud of myself. But it's absolutely true. Every good connection I made in the game industry that eventually got me published happened because I went to the Gamma trade show in 2000. If you go to trade shows, A, they view you as a professional because you've paid the dues to become a part of the thing that lets you go to that trade show, and B, the people that you're pitching to, they're only pitching to distributors. The number of people they're trying to sell to is much, much smaller, and as such, you have a lot less noise to cut through. You can make so many good connections at trade shows. Third thing, socialize first, pitch second. Treat publishers like people. They are not piñatas that you whack with a stick to magically get contracts out of them, right? The best pitch I ever had was because I waited a year before trying to pitch to a publisher, a specific publisher. And even then, I didn't initiate that pitch. I was standing around their booth at Board Game Geek. We were chatting about brisket, something. And somebody came up and without, no, I think he might have had an appointment to pitch. But the point is that it was painful, right? And at the end of it, he turns to me and goes, hey, John, you've got some games you want to pitch? I was like, yes. And one of those got published. So if you can, whenever you can, treat them like humans. Oh, by the way, if you're local, right, and you've got your car, that is power. Because if you end up being invited along, like, hey, we all want to go out for brisket, right? We all want to go out for ice cream. If you've got a car and you're chauffeuring, you've got people trapped in your car with you. Don't pitch to them. Talk to them about whatever they're talking about, right? Treat them like people. It works so well. But it only works if you start by going to the trade shows, you get to know the people, then you know them at the conventions, and then you get invited to go to dinner with them. Whoops, there we go. All right, how many people here love writing rules? I've done 140 times, I've gotten good at it. How many people hate writing rules? How many people make their prototypes and play their prototypes at events like Protospiel without having a written rule set? I am going to find every one of you and beat you with a stick. No, seriously though, A, write your rules, please write rules, right? If you have trouble writing rules, record yourself explaining the rules and then transcribe it. Some rules are better than no rules, but if you have trouble writing rules, use a rules template. This is the same format that I use in every single game I did on Invisible City Productions, right? Title, clever subtitle, design, story, object, etc. And it works. It's solid, it works, it makes it so easy. Go to invisiblecity.com if you want to see 120 examples. And on writing rules, when you write rules, oh, for heaven's sake. So it doesn't say it on here, but do not use the passive voice. You don't want me to come at you with a stick. But the other thing though is address the players directly. Instead of saying, on a turn, the player does blah, 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 and you end up with these really crazy sentence constructions. If you talk to the player directly, not only does it make it easier for you to write, it makes it easier for them to understand, and it makes it much more conversational. On your turn, you take the dice, you roll the dice, add them up, discard the lowest die, whatever, right? Address the player directly. Somebody, right, before this opened, I was talking to somebody, skip the boring part. If the first 3 turns always play the same, make them part of setup. If in the first 3 turns, there are only 2 or 3 valid decision paths, make them part of player selected setup. During setup, choose whether you want it A, B, or C, right? As soon as you can empower the players, right? As soon as you can empower the players to get into the action, get into the fun, get into the play of the game, the better the game experience is going to be for everyone involved. Oh, enhance with flavor, don't obfuscate. Oh my gosh. So if you do go into Invisible City and look at the games I put up there, you'll see Early Jonathan. Early Jonathan thought it would be a clever idea to make a game called 7 Pennies that involves taking 7 pennies, throwing them on there and trying to get head-tail pairs. And he thought it would be smart to use Abraham Lincoln references. And so you're boothing and, oh, it's so bad, right? Now I recognize that there's sometimes an IP that you can't get around, right? And that touched on a previous thing. And you have to use those terms, and in which case, give them a glossary, iconify, right? But if you don't have to use weird, obscure terms for things that are commonly called draw, discard, use draw and discard. The single best predictor for whether a game is going to get published is not having awesome mechanics. It's not having a clever hook. It's not great art. The single best predictor is persistence. I mentioned I ran Protospiel South in Austin for 5 years. I have played the best deck builder that I will ever see. And no one else in this room is ever going to see it, because the person who's making it, he's smart, it's a beautiful game, he's never going to get it published, right? Because he doesn't have the persistence to get it either self-published or licensed, right? The single best predictor of whether your game is, and everybody's seen bad games, right? We've all seen games that you look at and go, my gosh, how did this get published, right? Persistence. Corollary to that, one of my friends down in Austin, Dan Manfredini, he and I started getting published at the same time. We both got our first games published through AEG right when they started getting in the board game industry. Dan has significantly more games published than I do. He makes great games, right? I'm not ragging on the quality of his games. I'm not ragging on the quality of my games. But he persists. He is good. He is consistent. The way you're going to get your game published is by persisting. Repetition builds persistence. I went through 10 years where I put up 1 free game a month on Invisible City, 120 games. The first 7 were so hard. And after that, it became easy, right? But repetition also builds resilience. I'm not going to rag on anyone if they've got just 1 game and that's their baby, right? Or 2 or 3 games and those are your babies and they're precious to you, right? But if you end up building more games, right? The more you expand, the more you do, right? the easier it is for you to take feedback on those games, the easier it is for you to pitch that game to a publisher and say, hey, I want to put robots in there instead of hamsters. Personal experience, right? This was early in my career. I said, no, it has to be hamsters. I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to assign my game to you, right? Current Jonathan, you better believe I would have given them that game. Yeah, that's all. Oh, right. Perfect is the foe of finished. I have another friend, he's got a few published games. He makes fantastic stuff, and I wish he was making more, but he wants everything to be perfect all the time, right? Do not try for a perfect game. Do not try for a perfect rule set, right? What you want is something good. Perfect is the foe of finished. Is anybody in this room still afraid of having their ideas stolen? No? That's fantastic. Because you'll see this a lot from new designers, right? You see it in the forums all the time. Oh, I've got this game. It's the most innovative thing I've ever done, but I can't tell you about it. But I want feedback, but I can't tell you about it, right? Everything that I've done where I've collaborated has been better than the stuff I've done solo. Collaboration is infinitely better than solitary design, right? Share your ideas, play test fearlessly. All right, the next 3 slides used to be a full 40-minute presentation. This breaks my heart, but so I used to have a presentation called Practical Philosophy as Applied to Game Design, Meeples and Metaphysics. Breaks it down to 3 things: metaphysics, epistemology, ontology. Metaphysics. Metaphysics asks about first principles, right? What is the true nature of reality? The one thing that I really want you to take away from this, and by the way, anytime during this convention, for the next 4 days that we're all here together, feel free to grab me and take me aside as long as I'm not part of the game, and I'm happy to speak about any of this. But, all right, so metaphysics asks about the true nature of reality. When you're designing a game, the rules that you set up the metaphysical nature for the game, right? The framework for it, but the components you're using set up the metaphysical reality for your game, right? In a game of Monopoly, right, the board is not the board. It's Atlantic City, but it's not actually Atlantic City. It's actually a representation of the Atlantic City real estate market and fluctuating prices, but we're not going to go there right now. Dice aren't necessarily dice. They represent the nature of fate, or they represent combat ability, right? The randomizers that you typically use, dice, spinners, bead bags, and card decks, those randomizers have intrinsic assumptions about the nature of reality and fate baked into them in their physical nature that you cannot countervene. If you have a game where the idea is that they're all freewheeling, free-willed, completely boundless characters, right? That the characters are agents in an unbounded universe where they have absolute control of their destiny, and you're using a deck of cards that is shuffled at the start of the game that is never altered or reorganized, then you are using a component that sabotages your intent, right? You want to be using dice and spinners, not cards and bags of beads, right? If you want to say that events are not interlinked, that the fact that you landed on Boardwalk has nothing to do with the fact that I end up going to St. James, right? Then you don't want to be using a deck of cards or a bag of beads, because if somebody goes and takes a walk on the boardwalk in Monopoly, right, then no one else can do that again until that deck is shuffled, right? And as that deck whittles down, the probability of specific things happening becomes increasingly high. The point that I'm getting at here, and I'm taking longer on this slide than I meant to though, is that you gotta design with intent, and you gotta understand the true nature and the assumptions that are baked into the components you're using. You gotta talk to me more about this. I don't have enough time. All right, metaphysics, epistemology. Epistemology asks the nature of what is true, what is truth, what is known, what is knowable. As a game designer, epistemology is the thing you're concerned about during play. If we're playing a game and you have more knowledge of the game state than I do, you are probably going to win. If you have perfect knowledge of the game state and I do not, you're either going to win or you're going to end the game early because you know what's going to happen, right? You're going to drink my milkshake. Epistemology is what you're controlling as a game designer. You are deciding when to give players information, how, and to whom. And there's an entire category of games designed around this, right? It's the core of Battlestar Galactica, Werewolf, all those other, various games. Right, if I was going longer, I would get into the perfect gun. Let's pretend you're designing a game, and you have a gun in that game that does quintuple damage 16.7% of the time. I'm picking 16.7 for a very specific reason. As a game designer, what are you going to do to make a gun that does quintuple damage 16.7% of the time? You're probably going to say, all right, well, they'll just roll a die, a d6. And if it comes up 6, quintuple damage. Fantastic. But you could also have a deck of 6 cards. And one of them says quintuple damage and the other 5 are blank, right? But are you shuffling that deck and having them draw from it randomly each time, just the top card and then reshuffle? Or are you having them peel it off one at a time, right? Because if you're peeling off one at a time, and everything I've described there fits the model of 16.7% of the time, on average, you're going to get quintuple damage, right? With the die, though, you could go an entire game without ever hitting it, or you could go an entire game where it's just hit after hit after hit, right? With the card deck, you know that you're going to get it. Well, if you're shuffling, it's just like a die, then why in the world are you using cards in the first place, you weirdo? But if you're not shuffling it, right, you've tweaked the metaphysical and ontological paradigms. Woohoo! What a sentence. But you've done something to adjust player behavior. Because let's say every player has their own deck, right? And I've peeled off 4 cards and gotten nothing, right? And there's one player who's been bugging me the entire game, right? Travis has been bugging me the entire game, right? You better believe those next 2 shots are going to Travis. Because I know that one of those 2 is guaranteed to do quintuple damage. And what changed? Metaphysics and ontology, right? I'm sorry, metaphysics and epistemology, right? I changed the nature of fate, and I changed what the player knows. And doing those things are levers you use to adjust player behavior. So going on to what I was accidentally going on to, ontology. Ontology, really? There we go. Ontology asks, who am I, right? Who am I and what is my role? And players in games have 3 distinct roles, at least to my mind, right? There's the player, there's their in-game avatar, and then there's the role of that player in the game. And if you're not thinking about these 3 things, you don't have to explicitly call it out in your rules. But as a designer, it is important to know that these things are different. Digressing for a brief moment, I'm going to go into a tiny rant. The next set of rules I read that says that the player takes 3 damage, I'm going to take them, I'm going to chew them up. Because if I am taking damage in your game as a person, then something has gone seriously wrong. My avatar takes damage, I do not. All right, anyway. This entire bit on the side here talks about ontological shear, where the game doesn't completely understand the difference between player, avatar, and role. I'll just say that when you're designing games, make sure that you're thinking about the player as a person, the player in the game, and the avatar and their relationship. You can also get into really fun design space if the player does not have perfect control over their avatar, right? If the avatar has intents and wills of its own. All right. Those are all the things that I really, really wanted to hit. I wasn't sure if I'd make them in time, so let's go on to the secondaries. The single best gift that I was ever given as a game designer is a manual card cutter. With a manual card cutter, like this one where you can crank up business cards, I can make 40 cards in a minute, right? If you're cutting cards by hand with a paper cutter or with scissors, God bless you, or an X-Acto knife and a ruler, really, really look into getting yourself a business card cutter, right? And use the template. Almost all of my games use this format now, and it just makes it so much easier for me to crank out new prototypes. This comes from my experience at Steve Jackson Games. If you are submitting physical prototypes, and a previous speaker said, do digital ones, which is brilliant. That is brilliant. That is fantastic advice. I wish I did it. I don't, but just because of time and skill, right? But if you're sending physical prototypes, ignore this advice at your peril. This is probably the best thing I can tell you. I'm not saying ship it in a box. I'm saying that the box needs to have a box inside of it, and that is your game's box, right? At Steve Jackson Games, there were games that were sent in Ziploc bags. They weren't getting touched. They were put on a top shelf and forgotten, right? If you are sending your game to a publisher, put it in a real box, not the shipping box, but a box inside the box, and make sure that box is labeled with the game's name, with your email address, with your phone number, with the date you sent it in, and with the date that the submission expires on. Make these things readable from at least 5 feet away, put it on all sides of the box. If you do this, the odds that at the very least you'll get a response back from them saying, hey, thanks a lot, but this doesn't fit our line, your odds of getting any kind of response are radically higher. If you don't do these things, it's going to go on a shelf and it's going to get forgotten and probably cannibalized for parts. If you want your thing back, make sure to include postage in the box. All right, this is an advice. This is the one thing I'm sliding in as personal opinion, which is be a good example. Advocate for the things you believe in. I forget which speaker, it was you. You do educational games. And for the longest time, the tagline in my email was, games teach. Play is how we learn as children. Play is an incredibly powerful teaching tool for adults. This is why, there's this big burst of gamification fairly recently, and it's persisted. It's persisted because it works. If you're going to take the time that it takes to make a game, if you're going to pour your heart and soul into making a game, make sure it says something you want to share. I'm moving away from combat-focused games. A, there's enough combat-focused games out there. And B, I want to help teach that there are other ways, right? There's other ways to resolve something than conflict. 3 of the games that I've made, right? Run, Hamster, Run. On that game, you're a hamster on a conveyor belt that leads to a pit of hungry alligators. It is incredibly cutthroat, Run, Hamster, Run. It's all about shoving people into the alligator pit before you get exhausted and fall in the pit yourself. But my secret goal in making that is to show that animal testing makes no sense. As the hamsters in this game, I want the players to say, why does this experiment even exist in the first place, right? And so this is my way of getting a dig at animal testing. I have another game called Monster in the Cabbages, which tries to explain that it is possible to be a responsible capitalist and also be environmentally responsible, that you can balance these two things and not be an idiot, right? In the Island of Dr. Necro's second edition, which was our most recent successful Kickstarter, there's tremendous amounts of representation in the heroic roles. In terms of age representation, in terms of body type representation, in terms of gender. There are more than half of them female, because more than half the planet is female, thank you very much. Representation matters. Sending out the message that you want to share matters. Shrinky dinks. If you are not using shrinky dinks as a prototype component for your prototypes, look at it. You can get incredibly nice components by using, and you're making a face, right? But here's the thing, right? Is that you take your thing, you print it out big, right? You trace it, you cut it out, you throw it in your oven. You can make really, really nice, high quality, thick plastic components out of gosh darn shrinky dinks. Makerspace membership. Once you have access to a 3D printer and a laser cutter, so many more things seem possible. Tools spark creativity. All right. So the slide kind of speaks for itself, I hope. No, it doesn't. So assigning values to powers, right? In a game, you've got an economy, you've got resources, you've got abilities that get triggered. And it doesn't matter whether you're doing something that's character-focused, where characters have a movement ability and an attack ability and a defense ability, or if you're talking about something that's more like Agricola-esque, where you've just got spaces, you're doing worker placement, you've got cards and special powers, right? But if you want to be able to incentivize the behaviors that you want to encourage, you need to know what the values of the various effects in your game are worth. And you can do this just by kind of feeling it out. right? And like, oh, all right, attack's a little more powerful than defense, whatever. But if you write it out, it becomes incredibly powerful. It really empowers you as a game designer. Because then when you go through a playtest and all of a sudden you realize that the monster at the end of the game is way overpowered, right? Then you can go to your thing and you're like, oh, well, you know, it's 50 points, 50 times 4, 200 points of characters. It's a 200-point monster. What went wrong, right? And then you can take these levers and you can pull them and adjust them and change them. If you take the time to balance out, to just write out how many points each power is worth, you don't have to put it on cards. You don't have to make it part of the game's economy. You just need to know it as a designer. But if you're making an in-game economy where you've got to buy cards from a tableau, a la Dominion, whatever, right? This is an incredibly valuable and important thing to do. The corollary to it is if you're designing a deck-driven game, the Island of Dr. Necro, mine, there's an adventure deck, right? And you go through the adventure deck and you encounter various monsters, traps, events, and items. One of the very first things I do when I'm designing a deck-driven game is I figure out, all right, what kind of things do I want to have in the deck? Monsters, events, items, and traps, right? All right, how hard do I want this game to be? Let's split it into percentages. All right, I want it like 40% monsters, because monsters are fun to fight. Then 30% traps, because traps need to be there to create challenge. Then I guess 20% events and 10% items, because items are going to be really powerful, right? And so then once you have that, right, you're like, all right, it's a 100-card deck. Then it's going to be 40 monsters, 30 traps, 20 items, 10 rooms. Whoops, I got that reversed when I was talking, but the point still stands. Then once you've got that, then you're like, all right, I need to design 40 monsters. Well, I've already thought of 13, so I just need another 27, right? This really breaks it down and makes it very easy for you to know what you need to do and to fill the gaps. It also makes it possible for you to run the game before you're done designing it. You just have a few placeholder cards in there, right? Oh, that's a blank card, it's gonna be another monster. And if you're lucky, somebody's gonna recommend one to you during playtest. Used to be a lot bigger, but there's still, everyone's always looking for the next big hit, right? And people think that the way to get your game noticed and sold is to be innovative, to have the next big thing that no one's ever seen before, right? And using metaphysics, epistemology, and ontology, right? Those are the three tools I keep coming back to in my toolbox, but specifically metaphysics, right? Taking the components, looking at what they do, breaking them down, and then saying, well, all right, dice are static. If I'm rolling a D6, a standard D6, I'm never going to roll a 7. It's not possible because it's not on the die. But then, you know, a few years back, we ended up with a bunch of games that were using the zap dice, the ones that, you know, pop the little tokens on them. And around the same time, I came out with blank white dice, which literally uses blank dice and you write on them with a pencil, right? And the kicker there, though, right? They became popular for a period of time because it was something that dice can't do. Dice can't change their faces in the middle of the game unless they can, right? So your shortcut to innovation is to take a really strong look at various components that you're used to using and find ways to break them and make them do what you want them to. So as I mentioned earlier, I've done over 140 games. There are only 2 things I've ever thought about patenting. I have not patented either, and I'm going to talk about them because I am being brave and fearless in taking my own advice. All right, spinners. How many of you have ever designed a game with spinners? Woo! One other person. My soul brother. Oh, 2. All right. The point, though, is that spinners are the neglected stepchild of the randomizers, right? You think spinner, you think Hi-Ho Cherry-O, or maybe the Game of Life, you think children's game. All right. So imagine a deck of cards. Drill a hole through the middle of that deck of cards, just like they do in casinos, to null that deck, to make it no longer casino valid, right? Imagine that every one of those cards has a spinner chart printed on it. Imagine a little post that stands up from the table made out of plastic. Imagine taking that card, putting it on that post, putting a little cap on there that has a little dot on it, and spinning it. What you've just done is just created an entire deck of cards that are spinners that can be shuffled, that can be traded, that can be held in hand, right? You've created an entire deck full of spinners. Now you might be like, all right, so what's the big deal, right? But you can take spinners, you can overload them with information. So instead of just one bullseye, right? Imagine that this inner ring was also broken into segments, right? And imagine there was an outer ring also that's also broken into segments. And say they're attack, defense, and movement, right? And you want to make a troll that has a high attack, low defense, and medium movement over here. But then sometimes it has low attack, high defense, and high movement because it's charging in to attack you, right? The point I'm getting at is that if you start looking at the components you're using, figuring out what they can do and what they can't do and what they haven't been done with yet, right? You can start thinking of new ways, new realms to expand your design in. What I'm just describing there is the basis of a design I'm working on called Spinner Stellar, which is an open universe thing. It has intelligently programmed events and conflicts, and it's all using spinners. All the design work's done in the back end, and all the player has to do is put a spinner cap on and spin the thing. Innovation, tokenized dice. I was really not going to share this one. I thought real hard about not doing it. Let's see, I'm 3.5 minutes away from. All right, making a long story short. One of the cheapest components that you can use as a designer, something that makes publishers happy and can make you happy as well, is die-cut cardstock, or die-cut card chipboard, right? And that's the kind of stuff that, like in various games, you slot them together and make little stand-up cactuses and all that fun stuff, right? Imagine a bunch of tokens in the Platonic shapes, triangle, square, and hexagon, right? With little slots in them so that you can slit them together to make these two chip little kind of things. What happens is that you end up dynamically creating dice out of tokens that can be drawn from a bead bag. This is another direction that I'm going in, and I think it has a lot of interesting potential. But again, what it does though is it says, hey, as a player, you can create these really interesting, engaging dice on the fly with really simple components that you don't have to think about, okay? And I'm not saying this to say, look at me, look how smart I am, right? Instead, I'm saying this to say that if you start breaking down the physical components that you have and taking a look at the tools that you have as a designer, you can take these things, mush them together, and start making really interesting ideas. Diving back into easier topics, prototyping. A lot of people wonder, what do I have to do to make a good prototype? What is enough for a prototype? And all I can say is that clean, right? Make something, your goal as a designer during play tests at an event like this, you want something that is clean and easy to understand. Anything that blocks the players from understanding what they're supposed to be doing in the game is your enemy, right? And anything that you introduce into that is a form of self-sabotage. Temp art is good. We're not going to get into AI. But I used to say that even for publishers, just give them something plain, because they're just going to put their own art on it. They're just going to put their own graphic design on it. Don't go overboard with it. I think I might be wrong. So I moved to Michigan a year ago, and there is a designer there, Winston, who has a phenomenal track record with successful pitches to publishers like, I wanted to say Renegade, but I'm forgetting the names of the studios that he's most recently pitched to. Catalyst? Anyway, the point though is that he's hitting big studios doing, Plaid Hat, I think is another one. But the point though is that his prototypes are amazing. His graphic design skills are phenomenal. His art skills are phenomenal. Oh, I hate him so much. I actually respect him an awful lot. But the last 3 prototypes I played with him during our game design meetups, they've all been pro quality. I just look at them like, this is publication ready. What are you doing, right? So for publishers, you may want to try and go the extra mile if you want to, with the understanding that all the work that you do is probably going to get thrown out. The only other thing I'll mention is that I've got one prototype called Cthulhu. Eat Cthulhu before Cthulhu eats you. And a bunch of Brazilians became fans of it, and they did pro quality art and layout. And I'll be darned if that's not the one. It's not my best game in my portfolio, but it's the one publishers want to look at all the time. Very, very last tip. When you're at events like this, and less so with other designers, more so if it's, non-designers, they're like, oh, you should totally X, Y, Z. You should totally let players eat the cards and then turn them into salad, right? And they're going to give you some of the craziest advice you've ever heard. And so I'm very proud of myself. I actually just hit my time limit, so I'm good on that. Anyway, they're not actually giving you advice, right? And as an early designer, I would get, internally, I'd get upset. I'd be like, what are you doing? You don't even know how to, you don't understand this game at all, right? But what they're really saying, I realized that they were excited. They're excited about the game. Your game has inspired them, right? Your game makes them want to be a part of the design process. So when they're saying, oh, you should totally do this stupid thing that you already thought of 3 weeks ago and discarded, right? They're not trying to tell you what to do. They're telling you, you're awesome, your game is awesome, I want to be a part of the awesome. Oh, all right, so this QR code goes to the slide deck, this QR code goes to Invisible City, and this one goes to me on BGG, and that is my email address. Does anybody have any thoughts, comments, questions, tips that they have that they would like to share? Go for it.
Yeah, thank you. This presentation was fantastic. I really enjoyed it. Look forward to reviewing the slides later.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to be here, and thank you very much to the Game Crafter for allowing me to speak.
I did have a question about your point where number 15, I think it was, be a good example in teaching with games. You specifically mentioned that you were trying to move away from combat as a core mechanic.
Yes.
I'm a firm believer of that, and whenever I'm designing a game, I try to make the core conflict about something other than violence. I don't want to empower players to use violence to solve their problems.
Sure.
Do you find like a lot of struggle in trying to find compelling conflict in a game while avoiding conflict? And do you have a couple strategies you'd like to share for kind of working through those?
Sure, so I'm going to repeat your question for the studio audience. So the question, it's coming back to trying to avoid conflict as a core component of games. And you're asking,
Combat.
right, combat, right? Because there can be conflict without combat, which is a great point, right? And so you're asking, do I have trouble trying to find a way to create compelling engagement without combat, right? And it's something I'm still grappling with, right? Even in the most recent co-op design, I've been doing a lot more co-op than I used to. But my most recent co-op design is a Voltron-style giant robot fighting a monster, right? So all the players are working together. They're not fighting each other. They're fighting the game. And I'm cheating there, right? Because they're still punching and fighting, right? And that's actually the main reason why Spinner Stellar, the spinner-based game, is not with me at this convention. Because although I had some non-combat in it, there was still a pretty hefty dose of combat. And one of my, sorry, the answer to your question, right, is am I having trouble with it? And the answer is yes, right? And we could get into a socio-political breakdown of what it's like to be an American in the modern United States and the diet of media that we have been fed and things that we have been taught are good or bad, right? But this is not the place for that. This is a place, that's something you do over dinner. Dinner and poutine. But it's hard, right? It is legitimately hard. I think one of my designs that does it the best is something called Through the Gate, which is kind of an Alice in Wonderland, Narnia-esque one, where you're accumulating bravery and friendship, and it's not, I think it's just strength, right? And there's some conflict in it, but it's not necessary. Touching back on Dan Manfredini, an old design of his that does this really well, like blows my socks off, is a game called Venture Forth, where there's monsters and you encounter them, but 90% of the time you're losing. And it's okay because your characters are okay with losing, because that's not their goal. The bard wants to find great stories to tell, and the swashbuckler wants daring escapes, and so on and so forth, right? So I think that there's absolutely a lot of room for compelling conflict without combat, and we just need to start prying that open and finding the juicy bits. Go for it.
I think what you're getting at is that like you want to move away from violence. Like combat kind of implies violence.
It does.
And there's always going to be tension and conflict,
Mm-hmm.
but that doesn't need to be violent.
Yeah, exactly. Moving away from violence, but still having tension. Go for it.
To piggyback on that a little bit was just the idea of scarcity versus abundance. The world you design is, if you make scarce resources, they're going to compete and try and beat each other. The question I have, though, you said best predictor of publication is persistent. Bring it back to Dan Maffredini. Can you give us some example of what kind of persistence there is? Like persistent what? I call the publisher every day.
So, Travis is making the angry face. So the answer, right? Part of that has to do with being smart about how you're targeting and who you're targeting. And in a previous presentation, it talked about, targeting the right kind of companies with the right kind of games, making sure we're their portfolio. So part of that persistence is doing your homework, right? Part of it is politely pestering. This gets back to the box, right? Remember I said on the box, very last thing I said to put on the box, when your submission expires, right? And this gets back to what you were saying, which is clear communication and setting expectations up front, right? I'll mention that I used to be crap at all these things, right? These aren't things that I magically was like, oh yeah, I always set good expectations. I'm always clear and upfront with publishers. I always tell them when my submission's going to expire. No, right? I sent a submission to a publisher and, it was like 5 months later. And I'm like, hey, right? What's going on, right? And that's tricky. No, you don't want to contact them every day. But when you contact them, say things like, hey, my name's Jonathan Leistiko. I'm following up on this. I'm following up on Run Hamster Run, which I submitted to you on the 20th of October. And I said that I'd follow up in 3 weeks. It's 3 weeks later, I'm following up. Please let me know if you're still interested in this, or if I can go ahead and shop this around to other publishers. I'll follow up again in 2 weeks, in a week, in whatever, right? If I haven't heard back, if I haven't heard back from you within 2 weeks, I'll follow up with you again, right? And then, 2 weeks later, I say, hey, it's John Leistiko again. I'm following up on Run Hamster Run. I gave you a submission deadline. The submission expires a week from now, at the end of November. I'd like to know if you're still interested in this. If not, I understand. I really appreciate your time and consideration, but I'm going to go ahead and open this up again, right? Clear communication makes all the difference, right? And so, touching back on what you said, what does persistence look like? And part of it, right, I cheated with my answer. I said, part of that starts with setting good expectations up front at the beginning. Part of it is clear communication throughout, right? But then that persistence is saying, I'm going to follow up in 2 weeks, and then following up in 2 weeks, right? Persistence doesn't look like pestering them every day, right? Because they're going to tune you out. They're going to say, all right, I'm done, right? And if they do the courtesy of saying, I'm done, instead of ghosting you, which touches on another tool that I use, that I should have put in the slide deck, right? I use Gmail, and I use the snooze ability on emails all the gosh darn time. My teammates think I'm some kind of weird paragon of keeping a calendar. No, my head is like a giant sieve. But whenever I have an email where I say, hey, I'm going to follow up with you in 2 weeks, you better believe that the next thing I do is I go to the snooze feature and I snooze that email that I just sent for 2 weeks. So 2 weeks later, it pops up in my inbox and I go, oh, I need to follow up on that today. And then I do it right there because I'm like some kind of weird squirrel with hands. And if it's in front of me, I get it done, right? And you're laughing because you're like it too, right? If it's not in front of me, it's not in my brain, right? So anyway, what does persistence look like? Persistence looks like setting clear boundaries up front, adhering to those boundaries, and following up on them even when it feels icky.
That's really good. I like that.
You, all the way in the back.
Yeah, I was just going to make a comment about, balancing. You probably want healthy competition in the game, but it's crossing that line to combat, right? And where is that line? Because, I want to win games, right? But it doesn't necessarily have to be in that combat realm. But, like, when you look at sports, for example, there's a clear set of rules in sports that I would argue it's not combat, right? But that's all I was going to say.
Sure. So what you're talking about, right, is conflict versus combat, right? I'm going to lean on a design where I'm actually pretty happy with this one. Going back to Through the Gate, the kind of Alice in Wonderland Narnia quest adventure game. I was real tired at that point in time of games where you just said, all right, whoever has the most victory points wins. Yay, right? So at the beginning of the game, there are 5 goals set out. Most bravery, most friends, most whatever, right? And then I think most cards overall, right? And each one of those win conditions is evaluated separately. And there's other games that do this too, right? And so at the end of the game, I might not have won, right? But I might have had the most friendship, and I can say, oh, I got the most friendship. I got one of the 5 things. You might have gotten 3 of them, or even all 4 of the other ones, and you're like, I won the game. And I'm like, yeah, that's cool, you won the game, but I did something, right? And there are, so again, touching on too many ideas are trying to get out of the mouth at the same time. They all did the Three Stooges thing in the doorway. So the point though, right, is that you can have conflict without combat, right? And you can lean on sports. A few of my designs are sports leaning. There's one called Racquetball, where it doesn't matter. The point though is that I think that you can touch on sports and you can pull really interesting design structures out of that to create conflict without combat, right? I'm gonna pause for a moment because I am losing the train of thought. Anybody have any other thoughts, comments, or questions? Sure.
Yeah, I want to go back to the challenges set of finish a game every month for a year. I hear that and I'm quite intimidated. But I do like the idea of pushing myself and going further with my designs and finishing projects. Is there any suggestions on how I would go about doing anything like that?
Guess what you just said? If I was Groucho Marx, I'd say, you said the magic void. No. Oh, yeah, there's a bibliography at the end of this. But beyond that, 7, 12, 13, and 6 are magic numbers. So as I said, the first 7 games I did were hard, right? And they're all print and plays. So I'm leaning on D6s and dominoes and chessboards and checkers and things. There's like 3 or 4 different checkers variants on the website. There's at least 2 different variations on games of tag, right? But what that challenge does to you, right? It says, you're gonna find the core of fun, and you're gonna build as much around that core as you can, and then you're gonna iterate in following months, right? And while you're doing that, while you're cranking those games out like a mad freak, other games are gonna percolate in the back of your brain. And all of a sudden you're gonna start getting these bigger, more complex games. What the challenge does, at least what it did for me, it gets you in the habit of completing games. It gets you in the habit of writing rules. It gets you in the habit of writing clear rules, right? So, touching on what you said, how do you crank stuff out, right? You start realizing that there's interesting interesting numeric linkages. For example, poker deck, right? You've got 4 suits with 13, right? You've got a double set 12 dominoes, which goes double 6 through 0. So there's 13 in there. So you can create interesting links between dominoes and a poker hand, right? You've got a chessboard, which has 8 spaces on it, and then you've got D8s, right? You can create interesting linkages between D8s and a chessboard. So what I'm saying, this is a variation on what I was saying, that the shortcut to innovation is making stuff do that it can't do stuff it can't do. The shortcut to making games quickly is to take common components that everybody knows, finding the hidden linkages inside of those, and then pulling on them and saying, all right, well, what can I do with this, right? Where can I take this? If I've got a D8 and a chessboard, what can I use that for? Well, I could use it for random placement of landmines. I could use it for, well, I've got a game on the website called 8x8, where you roll a die and you choose which column or row with that number to place your token in, and then you're trying to make 5 in a row Pente style, right? And it works really well. It's a strong, robust game. And where did it come from? It came from saying, oh, well, a chessboard has 8x8 and there's a D8. What can we do with that, right? So looping back to your original question, how do you crank out a game a month? You minimize. you streamline, right? A number of the things on Invisible City I almost hesitate to call games, right? Some of them are more like toyetic activities, but I wouldn't have gotten to some of the game designs I have now without getting through those initial kind of proto-quasi-game steps. Anybody have any other thoughts? I saw your hand first, and then I'll get you second.
To address things, having meetups with other people where you make commitments to one another that by the next month, by the next week, I'll have something to show. That's a good way to keep yourself motivated and make progress. And incremental goals. I used to have a car full of crap, full of trash bags and stupid stuff, and I was like, why do I never clean this out? It takes all day to clean it up, and then I'm gonna vacuum the whole thing. I started a practice where I said, every time I get out of the car, I'm gonna take some piece of trash that I have in the car and throw it away. Did I make much improvement in one go? No, but now the car is completely empty. So if you can find something, like a classic thing that people do is work out every day. If you can work out every day, you can do this every day. Half an hour, make a card, think about costs, something like that.
So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to repeat what you said for the studio audience, which is he said that accountability, right? If you're accountable either to a game design group or to a bunch of faceless people on the internet that you've made a promise that you're going to release a game a month to, accountability goes a long way towards making sure that you set goals and hit goals. And the other thing he was saying is that creating habits of success, whether that's taking a piece of trash out of your car every time you leave your car, or making sure that you set aside 15, 30 minutes a day for doing additional game design. Green sweatshirt, and then you next.
Yeah, I wanted to just kind of bring a couple of your points together and touch on the persistence element of it.
Sure.
We were beating around the phrase, the fail faster ethos. Just, keep making stuff, even if it's bad. Don't be afraid of failing because you're just going to learn more, and the next thing you make will be that much better for it. So I just wanted to voice that. And game jams, I know that's more of a video game thing, but do a game in just a weekend. Even if it's just you and a handful of friends, that's even a shorter time, but that'll really get the juices flowing for that process.
So again, repeating for the studio audience. So the comment from the audience was tangenting off persistence. Most recently, at the end, he was saying game jams and making a game over the course of a weekend. But before that, I'm sorry, I forgot the.
Fail faster.
Right, and then fail faster, which again, the Invisible City experiment was part of, right? Just put it out there, right? And yeah, not everything's going to be golden, but there's so much more. A written set of rules is so much better than stuff that's kept in your head, right? And I know that's not the same as fail faster, but even if it's bad, if it's on paper, then it's on paper. And then it's something that you can take and you can etch and you can sculpt and you can rip apart and you can modify. As long as it's in your head, it's not out here in the world for other people to have and share. Sorry.
I was going to say, though, the accountability, like it helps if it's people you're doing things with. I've done National Novel Writing Month, National Podcast Post Month, things like that. And if I had somebody that I had to just answer to, that would be not very much fun. I'd avoid them. But
That's true.
Having a group of people that every morning I got together with, hey, how are you doing? How was your podcast? I listened to last night, things like that. That's what helps, is having a cohort.
So what was said, he's talking about National Novel Writing Month and being part of a collaborative experience across many creatives so that it becomes a fun social thing as opposed to going to your teacher and saying, no, I didn't do the homework last night, I'll get it done tomorrow. Making it fun and making it social, that is incredibly valuable. Yep, that's been, well, hey, I mean, I wanted to leave time. So does anybody have any last quick thoughts before we stop? In 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. That's a habit I learned from Zoom calls. Thank you all so very much for listening to me babble. You've all been amazing. Have a